Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, I have this great privilege to hear stories. And tonight we're not just hearing one, we're hearing a couple and their journey into the church. We do emphasize that a lot in the program, I think, that conversions are never alone. They do affect people around us, and those of you who've heard the stories all the years, you know that it isn't just one person, it's others. Sometimes people back away, some teams are drawn in. We might hear a little bit of all of that in tonight's story. James and Kelli Beaumont, former Methodist youth ministers. Welcome both of you to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. James, good to have you here. Since I have two stories to hear, I'm gonna be quiet real quick. And who wants to start?
I'll start.
Okay, James, let's hear your story.
I grew up actually Roman Catholic. I think I fell into the trap that a lot of Protestants and Catholics that come away from the church fall into. They misunderstand their faith or have a very shallow understanding of their faith. And to me, obviously I didn't have a real tie to my faith. We went to church and I altar served as soon as I could, and I loved altar serving basically because that moved the mass along a lot quicker.
What time period were you growing up in the church? What were the years you...
I was born in 75, so 75 through the early 90s.
The reason I say that is that those watching the program know that in the Catholic Church, a lot of stuff was going on at the local level when it came to catechesis and are things changing? And so in other words, you're brought up as a young person during this kind of crazy time for many local parishes.
We've talked about the Baltimore Catechism before, and I think that's kind of what we were going through. Probably the biggest catechetical issue that I remember as a senior in high school. And obviously, when you graduate high school, you graduate church sometimes. But I remember our parish priest at the time taught the seniors. And one of the things that stood out to me that really affected me is how he said that our non-Catholic friends were going to go to hell because they weren't Catholic. And that just really affected the way that I thought about things. And maybe that kind of went along with the idea that some of my Protestant friends had about Catholicism. Not having a deep understanding of my faith and, not having, what is said, that close personal relationship with God made me very thinly linked with the church.
Okay, so like so many, when you graduated high school, you kind of graduated involvement, and when you went away to school, then just...
The mom's not dragging you to church.
Been there, done that. All right. You want to catch you up to that point?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
I was born into the Methodist Church and very proud to say so. And my great-grandmother walked her children to our Methodist Church. And so I had great history and ties. And so my grandmother was influential in making sure I got to church, had all my dresses, and learned my faith in the community that I grew up in. And the older people, I'm so grateful for them because they made sure that I knew my faith, I knew who Jesus was. So there was some turmoil here and there and some inconsistencies in my home life that caused me at a very young age to see God as my stability. He was my father. And so I spent a lot of time in prayer at a young age, just wanting to know him more, and in the woods. And I absolutely, those memories are so fond for me. And so as I grew more deeply Methodist. I was a fan of John Wesley. I was a big fan of his mother. I later on, I would actually read John Wesley's writings and to gain a better understanding of the regeneration, of faith and things like that. So as I grew, though, there were some things that were a problem for me, and that was the fact that there was a different church on every corner. And I had family members that were Baptist who disagreed openly while I was in their home about my Methodist faith. And so I would be subjected to some debating, and I was just, 11, 12, 13, maybe 13, not even 13 years old. And so it left me a lot of time to sit and think about why is there such a disunity. So, that's a very unusual age to really be bothered by seeing, this much disunity, when I would look into my Bible and see a lot of unity being promoted in the Bible. So I saw this as a big problem. So during my high school and college years, I wanted desperately to understand what truth was, because I had heard so many different varieties, and I had even sampled some different churches along the way when I went off to college. And I was surprised sometimes about the doctrine that I would come across that felt wrong to me in my spirit. And I will say one, and just to throw this in there, because I had told him, and I never told him last night, I think it was when we were talking maybe, that I wanted to be a preacher when I was younger. Mm-hmm. And my mom was not happy about this because she says I was always drawn to men's jobs, and she had had enough. I finally said, when I grow up, I want to be a preacher. And so I was in this Methodist church. No, I'm sorry, take that back. I was in this Baptist church at the time, and I enjoyed the sermons. I enjoyed the people I was meeting, but there was a serious need for a youth minister. And I was in college at the time, and I felt I was able to step in and fill that void. And there was a lot of push and need and preaching and begging for a youth minister to step forward, so I did. And I found out that I was a woman and was not welcome to be a youth minister. And I remember the surprise on his face startled me a little bit. So that's when I thought I needed to, I knew there was an absolute truth. I needed to sit and figure out, where does a woman fit in religion? What is absolute truth and doctrine when it comes to baptism was a big one, and all these sorts of things. So
no, you two aren't together yet.
We are not together at
yeah,
all. Yeah,
okay.
I don't know him at all.
Okay.
And along the way of trying to discover truth in Scripture, because I really believed that it was found in the Bible. I really believed that somewhere there was an absolute good and true interpretation of what is being, said in Holy Scriptures. So along the way, I run into, I guess, apologetics and things like that, like John Ankerberg was a big name. And so I had acquired all these cassette tapes for my car, and I listened to a lot about the Catholic faith through John Ankerberg. Okay. So this is where I start learning about the Catholic Church in a bigger sense. I had mention of it in my childhood years, but not to this degree.
And not necessarily a big positive perspective.
This isn't a positive perspective at all. I was mortified, actually. I would go back to the book of Revelation and really link the Catholic Church to parts in there that don't speak so highly of components in our...
Right.
At any rate, so the Pope was a horrible person, in my opinion, at that time, and I had all of these Bible answers to why the Catholic Church was a horrible cult. And I was outspoken about this. So it's funny, along the way, I would say, okay, there is absolute truth, but I know it's not the Catholic Church, because that is one thing all of these others unify on, is that they do not agree with the Catholic Church. And so in a way, it unified all of Protestantism in my mind. Yeah. So I guess we get close in my story to where he and I meet. I'll say one thing, because it relates to when we did meet, which was at the bank we worked at. We had an employee there that I became friends with who was in a seminary, but I never found out what his background was or what his tradition was. And so as we were talking, and I get to respect this other person about his knowledge, I just casually asked him, so out of all of the different traditions. I didn't use the word tradition. All the different, flavors. I don't remember how I worded it. Of Christianity, what do you think is the most biblical? And he thoughtfully hesitated, and then he says, I really believe the Catholic Church has the best interpretations of Scripture. I felt myself shaking with frustration. And instead of respecting him and taking his side into consideration, what I did was I totally dismissed him as a legitimate, trustworthy opinion person. And I just, he came down instead of the Catholic Church coming up, because I had been so convinced of what I believed. Okay. And then we get to where he and I find each other.
All right. James and Kelli Beaumont are our guests tonight. I had one question I want to ask you before we jump on the next test.
Yes, sir.
So you were brought up through the hoops of the Catholic Church. Did you believe in God?
I believed in God, but I didn't rely on God. I didn't have that fatherly role that he fulfilled.
But the existence of God, the reality.
I believed that he was there, and I believed that he had these rules prescribed for us.
Okay.
That
because I'm comparing the two journeys you had. So you didn't get the faith very well, is what you're saying. But what you got, though, was a belief in the reality of a creator, and you got that.
Certainly.
And you did too.
Yes.
Now what you got was a real sound conviction that the Bible is, you got that?
Yes.
You got some anti-Catholicism along the way too?
Lots of that.
And you also recognize that there's a problem here. There's different churches.
Yes.
Well, you got that too, but you were told, well, those guys are all going to hell, and we're Catholics just fine, right?
Correct.
I mean, I was surprised to hear that your priest said that in that time period, because the majority of the Catholics, that's not what became the normal message anymore. Mm-hmm. So what you would find is, the one side, then you would have those that were holding true to what used to be, and it sounded like that where that voice came from, is kind of the pre-Vatican perspective. But that stuck with you. I mean, that stuck with you. So, all right. So now you guys are working at the same bank. Huh? Is that?
We are.
What the next step is for you too?
Yes, we are.
Well, probably to catch me up to the bank, and probably the next formative thing that happened to me was I was in basic training, and I was a medic in the Army National Guard.
Oh, wow.
While we were at Fort Sam Houston, one of our weekends we were invited out to, a day away, and that was amazing for us to be leaving training. And we went to a Baptist church. They fed us, and they put on, a worship service with an altar call, and they talked about being saved. And for me, just really quickly, I wanted to know what that was, because I knew I didn't have that tie, that reliance, and I thought that, I wanted to know that magic saving moment where I could just sit back and finally be at peace and know that I had there was a relationship between me and God. I wanted that.
Yeah.
I wanted to see what that meant, and probably from that moment and when I got out of the school for being a medic, I would go to churches and try to find what that meaning was, that saving point that you could reach. So.
And I'll add in that you were very frustrated with that concept when he and I met and would get into deep discussions.
That redemptive salvation did stick with me. So I was trying to align those two schools of thought and wasn't successful.
Well, there's a lot of different opinions out there on what it means to be born again. Catholic perspective, Eastern Orthodox would say that's very much tied in with the sacraments. Mm-hmm. Apart from that, there's no connection to the sacraments at all. It's just between you and Jesus, a faith experience, and somewhere in between there's 100 different perspectives on there. So it's understandable that, how am I going to find the right one? Mm-hmm. Especially, had you lost confidence in your Catholic background by this point?
I did.
Yeah.
Actually, I think Kelli can remember when we were married, one of our early experiences with my mom is actually, my mom was still a faithful Catholic, and just really dogging out the Catholic Church, and talking down to my mom because she was still Catholic and holding on to those horrible beliefs.
So when you two got married, you didn't agree to bring up the children Catholic? That wasn't a part of it at
We
that
didn't
point.
even date until he agreed to be what I was. You know, we in our dating years, I made a great Methodist out of James, and he was such a good Methodist. He had a background in finance.
Let's back up a lot. I pushed your head too far, didn't I? I mean,
it's okay.
how you ever got started? I mean,
Well, we started off as friends very easily, and we work well together, just in just our nature, and we also talked very deeply together, and very early on. And so, of course, religion did come up. And I remember even where we were in some of these conversations. And the thing that drew me to him was his work ethic, first of all. But even though he wasn't a practicing Christian, he had a hunger for God. I would say a hunger for God, of understanding God and wanting what other people had, more than any of the guys I had ever met. And the conversation we shared had less to do with our relationship and more to do with a relationship with God. And so when he brought up the fact that this whole idea of just say you're sorry to Jesus and believe in him and then you're saved, he was visibly frustrated by the whole thing. Well, here comes John Wesley. I had the answer. And I, you know, through scripture and through teaching how John Wesley explained the process, he was like, this makes sense. Well, the funny thing is at the time, I had no idea that I sounded Catholic. I had no clue that even I took what John Wesley said and I had put a little bit of a Catholic flavor on it even. But according to John Ankerberg, that wasn't Catholic, what I was saying probably, because I don't know if, I know I had never heard it from the Catholic Church.
yeah, it's amazing. Not only how few Methodists realize how Catholic Wesley was, but that John Wesley himself was probably not aware of how Catholic he was in his teaching.
Right. Well, I believe he was accused of it after he had written his work and his ideas, and he had to, I think he had to come out and say, no, I'm not.
Oh, yeah.
But that could be stories I've heard because, but I remember watching a movie about John Wesley and what the script had him saying, and it didn't match what I had read that he actually wrote. So then I learned later on that it's the spirit of John Wesley that is behind the Methodist Church, not necessarily his writings, as I was a big promoter of his writings. But yes,
So you're sharing this with you, right? And
Yes.
yeah.
And a lot of it does sound familiar, and it is very comfortable to me to be on the same track, to know that there's, you know, that redemptive process, that you take on some of the work.
Yeah.
And, you know, that ultimately you're granted grace to work through your own salvation, and without that grace, it's impossible. But there's a certain amount of work, and like Kelly referred to earlier, I like to work. I don't want
Yes.
things handed to me.
So yeah, and so it does match his work ethic, but it is, you know, apart from his grace, it means nothing. And being able to explain that to James, showing the connection between God's grace and our cooperation with God's grace. A real easy way to explain it to many people is, especially with some of my Protestant friends, is when I say, okay, they say faith and works. What I would tend to say would be faith means obedience. And you are called to be obedient because Christ does have demands on our lives as disciples of his. And it is a relationship, and part of that relationship is obedience. And so our obedience is our work, and our work is his grace working through us. And it was such a joy for me to see him have that aha moment. And And both of us were at a pretty stinky place in our history as far as our behavior goes. I don't deny the fact that we were in our early 20s and trying to understand what moral goodness was, because although I was very Methodist, the part of a moral purity, moral goodness, really wasn't taught to me. So I was left exploring a little bit. So he and I both had a hole to climb out of, and we climbed out together. And so we found, we started going to other churches. We do get married. We get married in our Methodist church that we ended up settling at in our adult years. And that's where we became youth ministers. But before that, in Lexington, where we lived, we went to some mega churches because they had a stage and lights and a band and a message, and nobody knows us. No one knew if we missed. Yeah. Nobody knew if we missed, and we felt good about ourselves and went out to dinner afterwards, because it was also a Saturday night service, so we didn't have to get up in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Perfect for us. So that's...
You touched on something I remember really struggled with as a Protestant minister long before I thought of the Catholic Church. But if the theology is stymied because you're worried about works righteousness, so in other words, this idea of the way you live makes a difference. I would not want to accuse any Protestant church of being libertine. That doesn't matter.
Right.
But the problem is the theology can stymie you to know, does it matter?
Yes.
Does it matter how you live your life?
Yes.
If in the end we say, I just point to Jesus and it's his righteousness that covers me, does it make a difference whether my faith changes me? Right. And there are a lot of Protestant theologies that say no. No, that wasn't Wesley. But I think a lot of Methodists have gotten their theology kind of combined with their neighbors sometimes.
Yes, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. It has.
Yeah.
Yes, that's not Wesley's way of saying things at all. And I know I debated the issue in college with other Methodist students about behavior. And as you say, sin is, we're sinful, but Jesus' blood covers us. But that's actually not the deepest truth. It's not covering, it's cleansing. Yeah. It is a cleansing.
New creations.
New creation, yes.
That's what Paul's, we're new creations if we're in Christ. And then the question is, once you're in Christ, can you fall out of Christ?
That was a fun one to debate too.
But from a Wesley standpoint, yeah.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, but from a Calvinist standpoint, no way. So you had these debates going on there.
Yeah, we weren't too far from the Baptist Student Union. So we had a lot of lively discussions, and I enjoyed it very much. But it helped me navigate the sea of doctrine, and it also helped me to understand why other people do the things they do. And I gained over the years an appreciation for other people's faithfulness. That's lacking.
Yeah.
But it also helped me understand why I can prove a Baptist position on baptism out of Scripture, just the same as they can. But I can also prove the Catholic belief and tradition, both with the Bible, but also with history. Yeah. That's the difference.
I'm trying to picture you during this time, James, because I didn't know if you had enough of a memory to remember what the Catholic Church had taught you as a young man when you're all of a sudden struck with these different opinions on this very important issue of salvation.
I remembered enough to know that it sounded familiar.
Okay.
Some of the things I was able to accept readily, and some of the ones were still in the back of my mind. I was still trying to churn through things at an unconscious level. But I think, our desire to work through these things and our ability to work together, I think that's what led us to accept being youth ministers at that Methodist church. I wanted to make sure that youth were brought up with that understanding that they wouldn't easily be led astray. I wanted them tied into their faith, so when they went out into the world, they wouldn't feel like they graduated from church. Like they wouldn't feel like they were just going out into the wilderness alone. I wanted them to have the church with them.
We knew a high percentage of youth left their faith once they graduated high school, and that was something we wanted to combat against.
Yeah, that's not just a Catholic thing. That's across
it's
the board.
across the board.
And even the most conservative churches,
Yes.
that's a problem.
It's still a problem.
Selfishly, too, at this point, we have our first child.
Yes.
And so, our eyes are on her, too, making sure
We want a good...
she doesn't follow her parents' early mistakes.
Yeah.
So at this point in time, you two are solid Methodists.
Methodists.
Catholic Church isn't even
Not
an
at
issue
all.
anymore. Well, in fact, you've even kind of burned some bridges a little bit, at least in discussions with family about that. So you're not looking back, you're looking forward.
Looking forward. Ordained ministry.
Okay.
Looking forward.
All right. Well, let's pause
Yeah.
there.
Okay.
We'll take a nice break right there, because the trajectory is like you said, ordained Methodist ministers and making sure those kids grow up good, strong Methodists.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's pause there. All right. I want to tell the audience before we take a break that you wrote the story, right, Kelly?
I did.
It was in our newsletter back last year, and it was called Truth and True Food Leads to Peace. So if you go to chnetwork.org, and you can find their story on our website. So we'll come back in a moment and pick up on the story. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and our guests are James and Kelli Beaumont. And we paused in the midst of their journey when they are on the journey, the trajectory, right? Methodist ministers, and that's a good thing. I mean, you're completely committed to Jesus Christ. You're bringing up the kids, making sure they don't grow up not knowing the faith, and
Yeah.
but you're on this program, so something must have happened.
Something happened. Yeah, a little bit.
Curveball.
It was a curveball. I still had that desire to be a minister, to be a preacher. I think really specifically I wanted to be a preacher. And I would have a hard time sitting through sermons because I would begin in my own mind imagining what I would be saying if I were behind the pulpit. And it was very difficult to put that aside and just listen to the sermon I'm hearing. And I really just had that stirring. So we had our second child. And I talked to you about that. And I ended up making a phone call and sitting down with my baby in my arms across the table of the Board of Ordained Ministries director about me coming into the seminary. I was thinking Asbury Seminary.
Yeah,
And
there
really
are
looking at
women
yes,
Methodist
yes,
ministers. I mean,
absolutely.
That's totally
this
an
was
open
not
door.
out of
Yeah, no,
sorts
totally
at
open
all,
door. Right.
and very good ones too. And so I was quite comfortable with the idea, and I did feel God stirring me to something, and I always recognize it when it happens. And so I left with positive talk and positive thoughts. And then I got home and I remember just staring out the back door into the yard, and I feel the Lord say, this isn't for you. And he had brought up some Bible verses too that jumped into my mind. I was very frustrated with that because he is telling me I'm on the wrong path. And so I accepted what he had to say. But then I was like, but Lord, what is this? What am I being stirred to? And so as a youth director, youth minister, he also had guided me to be doing my lessons, not based on any written resource, but to go to the Word, to follow his direction, come up with the lesson, and teach the youth. And that's what I had been doing all of this time. And so I have that behind me, a couple of years of, or at least a good solid year of just planning lessons straight from the Bible and feeling the stirring. And at about that time, we get a phone call that says our good friends he was a Methodist minister at the Methodist church we were at in Lexington before we moved back to our hometown, they were becoming Catholic. And it was just out of the blue. They hadn't told us that they were just, on the journey. They were there. They were ready. And just I have to tell you what we're about to do. We're about to become Catholic. And it floored me. And it floored you. Yeah. You were the most very restless, very pacing the house. What are we going to do?
Because obviously he knew that I was Catholic, and I never, I didn't have positive things to say during our discussions. And he's always been very curious about Catholic writers and Catholic ways of thinking. So, but it was still jarring.
It was very jarring.
Well, you had been fed the specifically anti-Catholic apologetic. Had that leaked over? Had you gotten some of that?
Yes.
I'd heard some of the
so
famous
you were both
Anchorberg
solidly.
tapes.
I indoctrinated him with all of it.
Yeah, and sometimes the ex-Catholics could be the most anti-Catholics because they hear that stuff and said, "Oh yeah, now that explains all that stuff that I went through."
Yes.
Just as an aside too, right before this happened, I was up late watching PBS, and they just had I had watched a couple-hour mini drama docu-series on the Medici popes and the corruption. About the indulgences and all the overspending and selling indulgences to
build that building.
To build that building. And
yes.
Horrified.
So hearing this, we were both upset, and we were like, we have to go save our friends. Yeah. And who better, right? We were the ones. So I call them up and I say, we are coming. We're bringing our babies, and we're staying at your house, and we're going to talk this through. They were like, yes. They were excited to have us come to their house. He said, the dad in the family, the husband, he was ready. He says, I need to talk this stuff out. I'm ready for a good challenge. And I was like, all right, we're bringing our good challenge. And I'm up for a debate, especially at that time in my life. Maybe not so much now, but I was very much a debater. Mm-hmm. So we pack our babies.
A good team we make when we debate too.
We do. We're good. So we get down there. It does not take long. I don't even know if we ate before we started in on discussions. Mm-mm. And I don't know who was the first to throw the pitch, But
what was the first salvo? I mean, what was the topic that would have been the first salvo for you?
Faith alone?
No, I don't.
Wasn't it?
No, it's sola scriptura was the.
Oh, okay. That's right.
Yeah, it started off with a big one. Okay. You got to keep in mind, my whole life has been finding the truth and the authority, the absolute truth in Scripture. And it had to be that the Bible was the only authority. It had to be, because there was nothing else. And then I had all these, this time spent as a youth minister preparing lessons, going through the Bible. And sola scriptura, boy, that was a rough one, but I thought I was ready for it, and it, right out of the gate, sola scriptura. So that, Bible alone. I'll say it in the way I used to say it, the Bible alone. And just that very early on, I'm going to refer to him as his name's Mike. Mike said, just very, almost exasperated, like, how can people say this? He said, there couldn't have been Bible alone for the first 1,500 years. There wasn't a printing press, there was no access to it. And that may not be a major statement for most people, but for me, with my background and all the effort I put into it, I really did feel like the rug was jerked out from underneath me. And I got hot inside, not in an anger kind of way, but in a panicky kind of way. I started to realize that you couldn't go to the Bible just like I could go to the Bible. Yeah. So I became very contemplative, and I start listening and thinking, and he starts debating more so. So I'm unusually quiet for the rest of the night. Unusually quiet.
I was wondering if you were noticing that.
It was very apparent, because we always have each other's backs, and she's my battle buddy, and I felt abandoned.
He did. He used that word. I felt abandoned. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I was, like I said, I'd learned about the Medici popes, and it would put into stark, contrast to what the infallibility of the Pope versus the personal behavior of the popes. Not necessarily understanding, infallibility is just speaking from the chair of Peter, and it only relates to specific
faith and morals.
In the declaration of the church. But, just these things that, I had built up in my own mind, this shallow scaffolding of sheltering myself from the truth of the church was just not holding up.
Oh.
Yeah.
We're still in, how long did that time with your friends?
To the late hours of the night and we went to sleep, and then we got up early the next day and continued discussing things. Mm-hmm. So we weren't able to stay for long. I think it was one 24-hour period, but it was very heavy in discussion. I don't even remember if we ate. I know we had to have, but I don't remember doing anything other than talking and sleeping. And I was learning for the very first time what the Catholic Church actually taught, which was hard to argue against if what I'm arguing against isn't even the beginning of truth of what the Catholic Church teaches. When it comes to papal infallibility, like he says, but purgatory, I didn't know what purgatory was because I had learned it through Protestantism. I did not learn it through the Catholic Church. All of these little things that I would have objections to, come to find out, I did not know what was really taught, what was,
Yeah, I mean, I can see why that couple of yours was anxious to have that kind of an opportunity because they had been where you were.
Yes.
They had all the stuff you had, they already had one time had, but they'd worked themselves through that.
Yes.
And so they wanted to say, well, does it work if I share it with these guys?
It's exactly the case. We were able to help solidify their faith even more so. And it left me in shambles. And I loved them, and I enjoyed my visit completely. I hated to say goodbye. Could not wait to get in the car because James and I had a lot we needed to discuss. Mm-hmm. And I knew I was a mess, absolute mess. And the one child who never cries, she cried the entire 2 hours home. On the way home, she cried. There was nothing we can do. So there was no opportunity for me to talk things out with James. And then by the time we got home, it was definitely bedtime.
Yeah. We were exhausted.
We were
mentally and physically.
exhausted. So there was no opportunity to talk. And so I went to bed that night, tears in my pillow, because I could see that it was impossible for it to be Bible alone. It was impossible because there was no written canon put together for 300 years, first of all. There was no printing press. There was illiteracy all over the world. These are things I'm starting to wake up to, just realizing that that's not what Jesus would have ever done. That would be a harm to us if he gave us a book and said, this is all, the whole authority is in this book, but not cure illiteracy, not have it be mass produced, not put it in the hands of every one of his disciples. And it tore me up. And so I went to bed feeling like I had no ground to stand on, because that was the ground I stood on, was in those pages. And
I remember when the scripture that is almost universally used to argue sola scriptura is 2 Timothy 3, where it says all scripture is inspired.
yes,
And my guess is when you realize that all scripture, when Paul wrote that, he meant only the Old Testament.
right.
That is an eye-opener
It
when a
is,
person
yes.
really realizes. It doesn't mean that we Catholics don't recognize all scripture
As it is.
is this.
Yeah.
But when Paul wrote that,
He wasn't talking about the New Testament because it wasn't formed yet.
Yeah, I mean, those are the little chips that come out of the foundation of one's faith. So.
Yes. So that night I went to bed just very upset. What is authority? I'm going to sleep. Lord, I know you're real. What is authority? And I woke up that morning and I sat up in bed and I said, I love the Pope. I was shocked at myself. I really believe it was the Holy Spirit, because I still have a long way to go to seeing the Pope as something I can look to as solid. But I realized at that moment, it is the church that was the pillar and bulwark of truth, which is a Bible verse that I had somehow missed in my upbringing. How did I miss it? I don't know. But yes, the church itself was the pillar and bulwark of truth, and was the authority, and was what Jesus established to hand down the faith.
So you wake up and you find out she doesn't love you anymore. She loves the Pope.
I'm shocked.
What did you know about the Pope? You know what I'm saying?
I didn't.
At the time.
Very little, very little. I knew very little about the Pope, and that's how I feel that it was God speaking into my heart at that moment. So
I'm more, I guess, trying to hold on to my thoughts pre-visit, and we have brought home several books on loan from the family we were visiting. David Curry's Fundamentalist, Born Again Catholic.
Fine book.
Rome Sweet Home, and another little book by a gentleman named Marcus Grodi.
Grodi, I think I've heard of it.
Oh, the collection.
That was one of
the first collection.
The first collection was on our shelf there.
So
you wanted to go ahead and start studying.
Right. I jumped right into Curry's book, and like I said, normally we're doing everything together, learning together, studying together. Even when we're doing Bible studies separately, we end up
on the same passages.
Right, on the same passages, or at least thematically, we're in the same spot. But I start reading Curry's book, and it's just breaking me down, really exposing my emotions to what I have shut myself away from, and I'm trying to get you to join in, and just talking about this chapter or that chapter, or the real presence in communion.
Well, that's, yeah.
And we finally start reading
together
from the beginning of the book, reading it together.
Were you jumping into those books still with the mindset of trying to show where they're wrong, or were you awakened to, were you moving in the journey?
I was awakened to the possibility that I was wrong.
Okay.
I wanted to see what was convincing them that I couldn't unconvince them of.
Okay.
I wanted to see it from their perspective.
Okay. And you wanted to become a Catholic already because you fell in love with the Pope.
Actually, no. I did put up some resistance. And so I told him I wasn't going to read those brainwashing books just yet. That I had to work some things out on my own. And I was more of a numbers person, so I started looking at statistics and shocked by just the population of Catholics compared to all of Protestantism combined. And the word combined is what really stuck out to me, because we do have the internet at this time. So I had access to instant information and found out just how small this Methodist Church is in the grand scheme of all of Christendom. And I'm really just overwhelmed just at the statistics of things. And so I'm chewing on things like that. I'm looking at history a little bit, but I'm not going to read the brainwashing books. And so he comes to me with tears, and he says, you've got to read chapter 2, I think it was, but it was on the real presence, which was also another issue in my past that I had been working through. The real presence, well, I'll just say this. My grandmother's a lifelong communion steward, okay, in the Methodist Church, and my mother also, and I was also in the footsteps, and I, helped to bake the bread for communion in our church, and things like this. So it was a big part of my life, communion, and it is in my mother's life too. I knew that the Catholic Church believed that that was Jesus's real body and real blood whenever the priest consecrated the host and the wine. But I was taught that that was just gross. Just gross. And so I hated it, of course. But I started, in the Methodist Church, and for a long time, I would go before the communion rail and cry and beg God to make that Methodist communion into his real presence. And I didn't even understand why I was hungry for it. So when he came to me with that chapter, and it was well written, there was no way I could deny that that was what I had been hungry for. And that began just on the fast track of all the reading and research we could possibly do, and no sleep for several nights, weeks.
How far are we away now from your actually entering the church? Are we years or months?
Months.
We're months.
So it's close.
It's fast.
Wow.
Because God had laid the groundwork
Yeah.
ahead of time. And he knows, and this is, if you know me, when he goes to move me, he has to do it quick. I almost feel like I'm on life support when you move a patient onto a gurney and transport them. This is me. I have to be moved quick and plug everything back in. And that's how the Lord moved me. He prepared me ahead of time for years. And then when it came time, it was fast.
And fundamentally, no one wants to be separated from the truth. And when you see the truth, you're exposed to it, then that is what you're drawn to. And that's what happened to us. We, just devoured this information, and I learned what I was supposed to have learned a long time ago.
I see you both have a different perspective on this. You're going to a place you
Never been. Very scary.
And never wanted to
lonely.
go. You're coming back. I mean, so it's a different perspective on that.
When it came time to realize that we both were in the Catholic Church, he said I could just go back now. I could just go to confession, and I am back. And he, sitting on the floor below me, said he was going to wait for me. So we contacted a priest, and this priest spent a large amount of time and one night talking to us.
During Holy Week.
Oh, wow.
What we did something horrible to him as a priest. I did not realize what I was doing. He gave us so much time, and in talking to him, there happened to be a fast track of RCIA that was about to begin that summer for a couple of people who had been lifelong, well, not lifelong, but all throughout their marriages. They've been in the church. They kind of knew what was going on. They just need to make the commitment. So this was a quick RCIA. And so by July, I was Catholic. So like I said, God knows my personality. When it was time, he had to move me quick. So.
What was the hardest in the end? What was the hardest barrier?
For me, doctrine, well, there's a lot of barriers. Family was a problem. Family was a problem, but that's not a problem the Lord can't solve. Doctrinally, Mary was a problem, and that one I had to really wrestle with for a long time. And I don't know how long we have. Okay.
Got about 6 minutes.
Okay, I can share this. I really struggled with the doctrine related to Mary, and it took me a long time to see her in sacred scripture. But man, is she there.
Yeah.
She's there from the beginning. She's there in Revelation. She's the East Gate in, I guess it's Ezekiel, talking in Ezekiel 44. She is all over scripture. I still was very uncomfortable with how much attention we paid to Mary. It took a long time for me to get there. There became a moment, though, that was defining for me. I was at we were at a youth festival kind of thing for our Catholic youth, and we were going to process down this neighborhood behind a statue of Mary, saying the rosary out loud, into the church where we were going to worship her son in the Mass, and it was beautiful. This was weird to me, but I was excited to participate in it. But I did make a conscious choice that I knew this wasn't worship, I knew this was honoring her, and I knew the rosary and what it meant. And so I process in this crowd. In the middle of that, a woman comes out on the front porch and yells at us that we are, worshiping Mary. She says, worship Jesus only, and she's yelling and she sounds very angry. And it was hard to hear it because I knew what it looked like to her to be in the middle of the crowd and be following behind Mary. But I do know the Lord was with me as I was choosing to honor his mother amidst that embarrassing moment. And my daughter, who was with me, also felt pretty embarrassed about the whole thing. But it gave me a chance to put my faith in Jesus into practice in a way that honored his mother, that shows that I love him and I love his mother, the same as I love him and I love my mother-in-law. I have a respect for her, and I have been able now to bring Mary into my home. But it has been a slow process to develop a relationship with Mary because of my aversion to any attention to be paid to her.
About you, James, did you have any particular barriers to get over, either from what lingering in the past or what you had learned since in the process? Or
No.
Okay.
We went through RCA, and I think the hardest part was, like I said, just waiting for her to come into the church and wanting to be with her to come into the church. Just, I was anxious and regretful, and I was ready to shed that guilt and come back and be in full communion.
Well-meaning people who don't have the whole story, and they've passed along things
Absolutely.
that they just have not taken the time to examine what they've passed on. And we can't point fingers; we're guilty of it ourselves. We are all guilty,
yes.
And so I mean that's a point of what love really means with our separated brethren. That's why we call them that. I mean that's what that means, and we're recognizing that, and through our baptisms and our faith, we're very united in our Lord Jesus Christ. We have 2 minutes left. I was thinking I could ask you all kinds of things, but here's what you were committed as youth ministers to making sure that these kids grow up in the faith. Now, as Catholics, what do you do to make sure that your children and others don't grow up and not knowing the faith the way? Any suggestions on that for our...
Well, I mean, we really start at home. We really think the parents are the first educators of the faith to their kids. It has to start there. We teach Parish School of Religion for 7th and 8th grade, and we're really regretful to see the level of knowledge that these junior high children come into our class and don't understand just the basics. So, it's really difficult to scaffold on top of that without a base. So, there's a lot of parental work that needs to go into it.
Mm-hmm. So,
What do you?
Well, we do homeschool. It is very much a Catholic homeschool. We give them as much. Well, we live the faith because how else is there to live?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, our Lord said that there's a narrow gate and a wide gate. Mm-hmm. The majority of people take the wide gate. And if we as parents remember that there's a narrow gate here, and Jesus said few, so we can never take it for granted. We can never take it for granted. Even parents need to know their faith a little better, so that they have something to give. This is a big challenge, and the church just needs to take that seriously.
Absolutely.
The church needs to take that seriously.
And that's people.
Amen.
That's us.
That's
us.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing your story. Again, I want to mention to the audience, if you go to chnetwork.org, you can get a more detailed description of it called Truth and True Food Leads to Peace. Right? All right. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that James and Kelli's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.